recorded interview for the Veterans Project at the Atlanta History Center. Today's date is December 10th, 2003. It is about 12:15 in the afternoon. My name is Hayden Pace. I'll be acting as the interviewer, and today's veteran is Dr. William Schotanus. Dr. Schotanus, when were you born?
August 30th, 1918, Stamford, Connecticut.
And you have any brothers or sisters?
I have one brother, younger, by 9 years.
And was he born in Stamford, Connecticut?
No, he was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
So your family moved to Philly?
Yes, he was born in 1927. William and Beatrice Schotanus. They're both deceased. They were both born in Connecticut, as I was. I was born in the same house that my mother was born in. Mothers didn't go to hospitals in those days, you know. They had their children at home. And I tell friends that I was born on the Boston Post Road because our home in Stamford, Connecticut was right at the corner of, I think it was Fairfield Avenue and what used to be the Boston Post Road. I think it's US 1 now, from New York up to Boston. But my mother was born there and I was born there.
Is the house still there?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I doubt it. There's been so much. No, I doubt it. Long ago, I think that home was destroyed.
Where did you go to high school?
Here in Atlanta, I went to a high school called Tech High School, which is now a part of Henry Grady. There were Tech High and Boys High in those days, both in the same block. And I think after the war in the 50s, maybe, or maybe even the 60s, I don't know when that happened, they were consolidated into one high school. It's called Henry Grady High School here in Atlanta now. Intense rivalry between Tech High and Boys High, you know. Boys High was more a liberal arts education. Tech High was more technical, as the name implies. It was for kids either who were going to an engineering college like I went to, or who were not going to college and wanted to learn some vocation. There were a lot of shops, mechanical drawing, things like that would teach boys how to do things, so that when they got out of high school, they not only would know things mentally, but they would know how to do things physically and could go out and earn a living if they were not going to college.
Very practical skills.
Oh, yeah.
And you actually went to Georgia Tech.
I did, yes.
When did you graduate?
1940.
What was it that your parents did for employment?
What?
What did your parents do?
My father was with the old Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, which was called A&P, Food Stores. And he was with them beginning from my early years. We lived in Brooklyn, New York, in Washington, D.C., in Philadelphia, in Birmingham, and then to Atlanta. All of that by the time I was 7 years old, I guess. He was transferred around a lot, quite a bit in those early days. But in Atlanta, he stayed and eventually retired. He became operating superintendent of A&P for the whole southeastern district, in charge of new stores and warehouses and things like that. He loved A&P. He worked for them for 43 years, I guess. That was his profession.
What were your first memories of the conflict that was going on in the world at the time you were in high school and even into college?
Yes. I entered high school in 1936, and of course Germany was beginning to rattle sabers, and Hitler was ranting and raving, and But I think we were not very attuned to international events in those days. I mean, I don't remember as a high school student ever being concerned about the war that was going on or the war that was developing in Europe. I think it was not until, well, did I say 36? I entered high school in 32. I graduated in 36, excuse me. It was not until I graduated in 36 and entered college that we began to realize that there was something very tragic going on in Europe. And I was an ROT student at high school, Tech High. So I had 3 years of ROTC in high school and 4 in college. Georgia Tech had an ROTC program not only for Army but for Navy. And its Army program was not only was infantry, engineering, and coast artillery. And when I graduated in 40, I had a commission as a second lieutenant in the reserves in the artillery part of the U.S. Army.
When you were going through your ROTC training, was there mention of the events that were transpiring in Europe?
Gosh, I don't remember that there were really. I think we discussed it every once in a while in conversation. As I say, I'm sorry, it was not a big thing to us. It's it's the provincialism of the United States that was our problem at the beginning of the war. With these two big oceans, one on each side of us, and we just have. There was a lot of isolationist, philosophy amongst our political leaders in those years, and I think I did not really become concerned or serious, and neither did my friends until I was maybe in later years of college, 38 and 39, when Hitler's armies, the Panzer divisions, started overrunning Holland and Belgium, and then into France. Then it became big news on in our newspapers and in our minds.
What was the general mood at the time? Was it one of fear or just sort of concern, or how
I don't think it was one of fear. I think it began to be certainly a national concern, and certainly an individual concern on the part of us that knew that we might be headed for military action if the United States got involved.
Now, when was it that you did head to military action?
When I left Georgia Tech in 1940, I went up north and worked for the Texas Oil Company in a research laboratory in Beacon, New York. And in about May of 41, I think it was May of 41, I received a letter from Uncle Sam. You are hereby ordered for 1 year's active duty effective August 2nd, 1941. And so I got a leave of absence from the Texas Oil Company and came to Atlanta, and then came to my first post, which was at Fort Screven, Georgia. Fort Screven is on Tybee Island off of Savannah, and it's an old seacoast emplacement that was built to protect Savannah Harbor from the British in the War of 1812. And some of the old guns were still there. Some of them had been replaced by more modern coast artillery weapons. And so that's where I went, reported for duty August 2nd, 1941. Fort Screven, Georgia, my first post of duty.
Do you remember your first day?
My first day? Oh, yeah. Well, I was very pleased that a couple of friends of mine from Georgia Tech had been ordered to the same outfit. My friend Dixon Kirby and my friend Earl Prendergast. And we just had a great time together, really, renewing friendships because we had all been in different places since we had left school. And now we were together, and we were all courting girls in Atlanta, so we were running up to Atlanta every weekend that we could get off to socialize a bit and to get back in time for Reveille on Monday morning.
What was training like?
Well, training was seacoast artillery. We used 155 millimeter guns. We transported them around, pulled them by trucks. They had their own wheels. We emplaced them on beaches, not only in Georgia but down in Florida on maneuvers. And we fired at seaborne targets, targets that were pulled by boats from the Corps of Engineers, and that was our training as far as using coast artillery guns. I realized that I didn't want to spend the rest of my military duty in that kind of an outfit, and I had always wanted to fly. I had made model airplanes. I knew from the sound almost of airplanes that were in the sky. So I put in for pilot training with the Army Air Corps. That was before it was called the Air Force. It was called the Army Air Corps. And I had orders to report to Kelly Field, Texas on December 20th, 1941. Then along came Pearl Harbor. I was, let's see, my friend Dixon Kirby and I were playing ping pong in the officers' club of Fort Screven, Georgia, when we heard the news over the radio that the Japanese had dropped the bombs on Pearl Harbor. And oh my goodness, that did change so many things for the next few weeks. Immediately, orders started coming down from Washington to our battalion commander. I was a reconnaissance and intelligence officer for the battalion. And so my orders were to take squads of machine gun squads down the coastal highway and deposit them at every bridge and every power plant and every airport, any installation that was important to the welfare of the United States. And so I was running up and down the coast of Georgia and Florida with my Jeep and my driver, and I got him out there and then realized, oh my gosh, I got to feed these guys, you know. So we start then running trucks down there with rations to feed them. So that's the way it went for several days and several weeks, in fact. I had to leave in order to report to Kelly Field, Texas. So, but the outfit went on. Later on, the outfit went on to Trinidad, and they stayed on the island of Trinidad all the rest of the war, which made me very pleased that I did not go with them, because all they did was, well, if you wanted peace and quiet, I guess that would be the place. All they did was to, look out for the occasional German sub in the Caribbean area, which there were very few. But they were there to protect the waters of the Caribbean area against the inflow of possible German submarines, as was the Navy patrol boats who were looking out for them too. Because of my impending duty with the Air Corps, my fiance and I decided to get married on December 16th. And then I left 2 days later and drove to San Antonio, to Kelly Field.
What was your fiance's name?
Harriet Wilkie. Beautiful girl that I had known for about 3 years. Very popular at tech dances, and we hit it off real good, and she agreed to marry me, and we had a wonderful time together. It just didn't last long enough. To Kelly Field, there was 6 weeks of what do they call that? There were a lot of classes and preparation and physical exercises and everything before we went to primary school. We went to primary school up in Fort Worth, Texas, and learned how to fly the primary aircraft. We had 2 types of primary aircraft, the low-wing PT-109 and the biplane, the PT, let's see, what was that? PT-26, something like that. That was a Stearman. Anyway, I got along fine in primary school. In basic school, I had problems. I had gold bars on my shoulders because I was already a lieutenant, and I was having trouble with an instructor who resented, I think, my gold bars. And my instructor and I just didn't get along at all. He made it very uncomfortable for me. He was very critical of my ability to handle the aircraft. I had a couple of minor accidents because of it, and he finally said that he reported to the board that I was unfit for flying. Well, I didn't think so. If I'd had a different instructor, I think I could have made it. But I was sick about it. But we lost about 30% of our class who, what they call washed out during basic training. We all got through primary flight school fine, but in basic training it was a lot harder, and so I was one of the big disappointments of my life.
What kinds of things were you doing during basic training?
Basic training? Well, we were flying a more powerful aircraft. We were learning how to land and take off and do maneuvers and fly in formation and that kind of thing. We had not gotten to night flying yet, but
So your instructor declares that you are unfit to fly.
Yeah. So I went back into artillery and opted for anti-aircraft artillery and reported to a new battalion, regiment that was being put together down in Houston, Texas, near Houston at Camp Hulen, Texas, Hulen. It was the 607th Anti-Aircraft Regiment, and I was assigned to one of its battalions, which was the 202nd Anti-Aircraft Automatic Weapons Battalion. We had training in Texas. That was about April of 42. And we were there all the rest of that year. And in about January of 43, we were ordered to take the battalion, take the whole regiment to Camp Cook, Camp Cook, California, Cooke. So we departed for California. During our stay in Texas, my goodness, we had one of those hurricanes that came in off the Gulf. We had to evacuate the camp, take all the men and what vehicles we could take with us up to someplace inland. And we bivouacked the men in school gymnasiums and places like that until the hurricane went by, and then went back to the camp. And oh my goodness, what a mess it was, you know. Dead animals and trees and all kinds of debris had come in off the Gulf, and the water line on all of the buildings was up about right there. Water had come in, all that mess had come into buildings, you know. We spent weeks cleaning that place up. What a mess. We took the battalion out by train, the guns and vehicles on flat cars. I remember being in charge of a group of men whose duty was to be sure that the wires and the cables that were holding the guns and the vehicles down to the flat cars were kept tight the whole voyage, the whole trip out to California. And that's an experience, to walk on flat cars on a train while it's going, you know, and tightening the cables and chains on these vehicles. We never lost anybody, but that's an experience. We got out to Camp Cook in the middle of a foggy night when evidently nobody expected us. And we had to find where were we going to put all these men and all this equipment, take them off these trains. And that was a mess. It was missed communication. We were at Camp Cook for, that was about January, February. We were there until November of 43. Camp Cook was an armored training post. Armored divisions had used that as a training post, and they were getting ready for the African campaign. So they sent us out to the desert for desert training, and we had to live on a canteen of water a day, including washing with it and brushing our teeth with it and drinking with it and all of that. I remember one day we found what was the name of that? It was a hot spring up the way, Tecopa Hot Spring. Oh my goodness. In rotation, we took groups of men up to that hot spring, and it was glorious. Man, it was wonderful, warm water, and you know, the guys just dived into it and soaped all over and just rejoiced. They didn't want to get out of there for the next group of men to come in, you know. We were living in tents under a hot California sun in the Mojave Desert for 3 weeks, shooting at tow targets that airplanes were dragging by us, you know, and learning how to live in the desert because we were destined for Africa. We got back to Camp Cook, and the African campaign eased up, and they decided to send us to the jungles of New Guinea after having all this desert training. We left I had a wonderful 4-day furlough, I remember, with my wife. By the way, she had come to Texas with me after I found a place for us to live. We lived together for those months in a nearby town, Bay City, Texas. And then when we went to California, I found a place for us to live in a nearby town, Lompoc, California, Lompoc. And we had some wonderful times together there. We had a 4-day furlough, I remember, during 1943, and we went to Yosemite National Park. Oh my goodness. I used to think Yosemite National Park was the most beautiful place on earth. Well, I still do. It's one of them. We had a glorious time together at Yosemite. I remember that I was taking Kodachrome pictures in those days with a 35 millimeter camera, and my cartridge stuck in my camera, and I asked a ranger if there was a dark room, a photography studio in the valley, and he said yes, there's a nature photographer right up the road. He'd be glad to do it, I'm sure. I went up there, and there was a man who was very polite and kind, and he fixed up my problem. I found out later it was Ansel Adams, the renowned photographer whose best pictures, were taken in Yosemite Valley of Half Dome and El Capitan and so forth. Well, we had orders to leave for the South Pacific November the 6th, I think it was, 1943. So we had to kiss our wives goodbye and send them home. We went up to San Francisco and boarded what the Army called the USS West Point. The West Point. It had been the USS America. It has been a passenger liner, one of our largest. We put 9,000 troops on board that ship. They were really cramped in. We left San Francisco and we were headed for Australia. And because that was a modern ship and did not need any submarine escort, we could do, gosh, I can't remember the knots. I think we could do 20 or 25 knots or something like that. So we didn't have any escort. We went through the Coral Sea and never saw a Japanese submarine. We were headed for Australia, and all of a sudden we got news that in New Guinea that the Australian Army had chased the Japanese back across the mountains into western New Guinea over toward Port Moresby, and we could land at the harbor of Milne Bay, Milnebay, Milne Bay, which was at the toe of New Guinea. We were the first American troops to land at Milne Bay. So believe it or not, I never got to Australia. We were over there 28 months and I never got to Australia. We landed at Milne Bay, and that was our base for a while. We had to find places to bivouac the men. We were all in these big pyramidal tents that would hold about 8 or 10 cots and footlockers for 8 or 10 enlisted men. The officers had it a little nicer. We all messed together, and we were put on, for a while, we were put on just ordinary kinds of, or I should say other types of duties, because this was a pretty remote area from air attacks, although the Australian anti-aircraft were already set up around the airstrip. I remember, in fact, that's where I got my worst injury of the war. One night I had some men who were helping out unloading a ship, and I was seated in the right seat of a Jeep, and my driver was seated in the left side, and we had a Coleman gasoline lantern that we'd been using, and it was raining, and we were low on gasoline, so my driver said, "We need some more gas, Lieutenant." So we went to one of these Army filling stations. We forgot about the Coleman gasoline lantern sitting on the back seat. So in a Jeep, the gas tank is underneath the driver's seat, and so you have to pull up the cushion and open the tank, and you start filling it. Well, the fumes got back to that Coleman gasoline lantern, and the Jeep blew up. And I rolled out of that Jeep. I was on fire. I had flame all over me. And I rolled out of that Jeep into a mud puddle and tried to, wet all of that and get all. I got it all except on my right leg, and I had to spend a few days in the hospital because I had pretty severe burns on the right leg. But that was the worst. That was I guess the only serious injury I had during the whole war. Douglas MacArthur was in charge of the offensive from his headquarters in Australia in those days. And his plan was to leapfrog up the coast of New Guinea and finally get back to the Philippines. He had been pushed out of the Philippines by the Japanese landing shortly after Pearl Harbor on the island of Luzon and taking over Corregidor and the town of Manila, and having troops on all the other islands. And so his goal was to retake the Philippines. But to do that, we had to move up the coast of New Guinea first and then hop into the Philippines. And so that's what we did, along with, first of all, the 41st Division and then the Marical Division of Infantry. We were a separate battalion attached to them. We went along with them to protect them from Japanese aircraft, from strafings and bombings. So we leapfrogged up the coast of New Guinea, first at Hollandia, and then Aitape, Aitape, and Finchhaven, and then Sarmi, Sarmi, and Wakdi Island, Wakde Island. Those were just temporary stops along the way. We were there just a few weeks in each place. The most time we spent in New Guinea was on Wakdi Island. My battery, C battery of the 202nd, was set up around the airstrip on Wakdi Island. Wakdi Island had been a Japanese airstrip until we chased them out of there. Then it became one of ours. And so our Air Force moved in, and we had B-24 bombers, and we had reconnaissance planes, we had fighters, and we were there for about 5 or 6 months, 5 months maybe. A lot of enemy action. We had a lot of Japanese air raids at Wakti Island. They'd come in mostly at sunset and drop bombs or strafe. And fortunately, not a great deal of damage. They hit mainly airplanes that were parked on the airstrip, and but my boys got plenty of action, which they liked.
What do you mean by that?
Well, they enjoyed doing what they were trained to do. You know, they had not had much chance down in New Guinea, Lower New Guinea, and this was the most action that they had seen since they had gotten into service there on Wakti Island.
Were they fairly successful?
Oh yeah. We claimed. I think we claimed 9 Japanese aircraft on Wakti Island, and there were a lot of several others that were unprovable. We didn't know whether we had really gotten them or not. We might have seen them smoking, going out of our vision. It might have gone down in the sea, but we were not sure about that. So yes, they were very pleased to be doing what they had trained for. This bunch that we had, a lot of those boys came off the farms in Arkansas, in Mississippi, in Louisiana, Texas, and Oklahoma. And down at Camp Hewlin, Texas, we had to I think some of those boys had never worn shoes before they came into the Army. We had a great time with them, teaching them a close order drill and right turn and left turn and all of these things, about face. And it was very difficult for them at first, but they turned out to be good, dependable soldiers. After they got it, you know. And they were loyal to each other and to us, and respectful of rank, and we had a good, disciplined outfit in those days. I was very pleased with it. Well, from New Guinea, we went, and by the way, each of these leapfrogs, we went by sea, not by land, and we went by LST, Landing Ship Tank. LST is a 3,000-ton floating bathtub. It has 2 decks and a ramp. You load from the front end. It can come right up on a beach, and the ramp can come down, and your vehicles can come right out, and you can start deploying them right away, which is very valuable. We made 13 separate trips by LST in the South Pacific in those 28 months. My goodness. For the enlisted men, it was cramped conditions. The officers had it a good deal better. But for all of us, it was a chance to get a fresh egg, you know, and fresh bread and butter, and some good food. The Navy had it good. For the officers, it was a chance to sleep on sheets in a real bed, you know, and to drink water out of a crystal glass in the officers' wardroom. So it was a kind of a relief from the ordinary. We landed at Leyte in the Philippines on October 20th, 1944. And almost immediately, see, we were not the first wave at Leyte, so the infantry had pretty well gotten the Japanese out of there, although we were still getting some air attacks. We got some air attacks even while we were at sea. And Navy gunners on board LSTs, and the convoy that we had convoys of destroyers or cruisers. They were shooting at Japanese fighters and bombers. But almost immediately after we got to Leyte, we began preparing for the next operation. We were to go out and land on the island of Mindoro. And we loaded up again on LSTs at Leyte, and we sat out in the harbor for a week or 10 days because they delayed the D-Day at Mindoro, I remember. It was supposed to be in early December, and it didn't happen until December 15th of 1944. But on the way to Mindoro, we got hit several times by kamikaze aircraft. We lost one LST. It was not from my battery. It was another battery, and several of our men were killed or injured. We landed on Mindoro December 15th, and we set up around the airstrip and on the beach at Mindoro. And we were there for several months. Mindoro was up north close to Luzon, and MacArthur wanted it because he wanted to use that airstrip as a cover for his Luzon operation, which was the last operation to reclaim the Philippines. And so Mindoro was important strategically for him. The Japanese didn't want us there, and we had air raids every night and sometimes in the daytime. I remember days when there were more Japanese planes in the sky than our own. And when it was difficult to shoot because you were not sure, you had to be sure about your target. One night, we had a Japanese part of the Japanese fleet came within striking distance of us. We didn't know whether they were going to land or not. They were throwing shells through the night onto the island. Our bombers were taking off. They called it the shortest bomb run in history because B-25s were taking off of our airstrip, and only about 2 or 3 miles out they were dropping bombs. We moved guns down on the beach in order to use these anti-aircraft artillery guns as field artillery in order to perhaps repel a Japanese invasion, because we weren't sure whether they were going to invade the island or not. They never did, but they sure lobbed a bunch of shells onto the island. I remember the next morning after that, on the beach, we found the longest torpedo that I had ever seen. And the Navy had a PT base on Mindoro, and the Navy people came up there, and they had never seen such a long one. I think that thing was something like 30 feet long. It had come off of one of those Japanese battleships, and it had missed its target. I don't know what it was shooting at, but it had finally just come up on the sand, and there it lay. I don't know what the Navy finally did with it. It was huge. After we took the Philippines and MacArthur came back, we were sent down to the island of Mindanao, to the town of Zamboanga. You've heard of that expression, the monkeys have no tails in Zamboanga?
Right.
Well, they do. We were there for 3 or 4 weeks. I had to take a battery of guns down to another island in the Sulu archipelago. That island was Tawi-Tawi, Tawi-Tawi. It was about 30 miles from the coast of Borneo, and the Australian Air Force was covering the Borneo operation, and so they wanted to use that airstrip as a place for their planes, and so we set up around that airstrip to protect that airstrip from Japanese possible bombing attacks. We were there when the Enola Gay dropped the bomb on Pearl Harbor, on Hiroshima. And in fact, we had been training for the next move, which would have been as a part of an invasion group onto the island of Honshu in Japan, which was made not necessary, of course, by the dropping of the bombs, atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Japanese surrendered. It was a horrible thing at first, but when we thought about it, you know, what our Air Force would have done to Tokyo in preparation for our invasion of that island, and the lives that were lost would have been lost not only by Japanese but by Americans, probably would have been more than resulted from the atom bombs drop on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the Japanese surrendered, and we were made military police for a while on the island of Mindanao. Finally, we got orders to come home. Our ship arrived. It was a Liberty ship bound for San Francisco. We boarded it and got back to San Francisco Harbor on December 18th, 1945. Joyous to be back. And it was a wonderful sight seeing that Golden Gate Bridge in the distance as we approached San Francisco Harbor. We awaited transportation to come back to our homes. Everybody was trying to get either their husband or their son back home for Christmas, and so senators and congressmen were putting pressure on the War Department to provide us transportation, and I think every train and every airplane and every bus in the United States was trying to head for these debarkation points where military was coming back from Europe and from the South Pacific. We did not load up on a train. We sat there for a week waiting for transportation. I remember we left San Francisco Christmas Day, December 25th. And it took us several days to get across the country. There were no Pullman cars in those days, and we were all loaded in coaches, and we slept in those coaches. They had wicker seats and wicker backs, and we found out that with a screwdriver you could knock the back down, take the screws out, put the back down. So we made one complete bed the whole length of the car. And that's where we slept during day and night. So glad that I was mustered out at Fort McPherson. I had terminal leave. I had not been able to have any leave for a while, so I had terminal leave for 3 months. So my effective date of termination was March the 6th, 1946. But I actually got home on New Year's Eve of 1945. Glad to be home.
How was the transition from service to civilian life?
It was not that difficult. I had a personal tragedy in my family. With my wife, she was expecting. Well, this was a couple of years later. Our first child, and she was never well after the baby came, and she died 7 months after our child was born. So that was a personal tragedy that affected me greatly. My own transition to civilian life was not that difficult. I went back into engineering. I worked partly with the York refrigeration and air conditioning people and Rich's department stores in installing air conditioning equipment into their new store for homes down in downtown Atlanta. And then I went with the Foxborough Instrument Company, which was automatic controls for industrial processes, which was very interesting. Because of the tragic loss of my first wife, and the care that people in churches gave to me after that, the concern and the compassion, I began to take the church seriously when I had never done it before. And about a year and a half later, I decided to change my professions and go into the ministry. Some have called it human engineering. I had a small child on my hands. My parents, especially my mother, helped me greatly with taking care of my daughter. I went to Columbia Seminary here in Atlanta for 3 years and received a bachelor's degree in divinity and then a master's degree. I married again 4 years after my first wife died and took a new bride and a 5-year-old daughter to my first church in 1953. And put in 30 years in the ministry in various places as a Presbyterian minister. As far as my military relationship, when I decided to become a minister, I transferred from the Artillery Corps in the Reserve to the Chaplain Corps. And I put in several years of duty first with the Tennessee National Guard and then with the North Carolina National Guard. I finally let it drop, though, because it got to be too much of a burden for summer camp every summer and drill night or meeting night once a week, and I just didn't think that I needed to do that. It would be nice now to have the military pension, but I dropped it.
What is a minister's impression of his service, his past service? I mean, that must have influenced your perspective on your time from 41 through 46. Later, having gone through this experience.
It did greatly. It did greatly. War is hell, you know. War is only to be used as a last resort, certainly when all other means have not been successful. But sometimes necessary at that point. But even when necessary, it's just a tragedy in human life and God's good earth. The relationship of soldiers and sailors and airmen as they're doing what they feel is necessary, a just cause, is wonderful to see, though, how it can bind friendships. And I keep in touch with guys that I knew in those days. I continue to go to reunions of my Army outfit. And, you know, you build friendships that last forever. And it's something that we had to do. I feel for the Vietnamese veterans because that was a different kind of war, and I think we never should have gotten into it. It became a political thing, and the military was not able to do what they were able to do, and the veterans were not honored as we were. I think ministers as chaplains have a real place in military duty, to help soldiers to see that that God is a peaceful and just God, and that prayer and linked with military service, well, military service may be necessary at times, and prayer and relationship with the church and with the chaplain can be very helpful. Chaplains in the Army sometimes, though, are they become against their own desires too involved in games and recreational management and social services and things like that. Sometimes unable to free themselves with enough time to do the kinds of work that they want to do, I think.
Well, Doctor, is there anything that I have failed to ask you about or that we haven't covered that you feel is valuable?
I don't think so. We had a job to do. We didn't start that war. We came to the rescue of our friends in Europe, and we dealt with a Japanese empire that was bent on taking over all of the islands in the South Pacific, and we could not allow that to happen from a political, economical basis. We felt we did what needed to be done, and I think that all World War II veterans feel good about that.
Well, thank you.
Okay, all right.